the Paleo diet. Millions of people follow it right now, eating the way they believe our ancient ancestors ate: meat, fish, vegetables, nuts, and strictly cutting out grains, legumes, dairy, anything processed. The entire premise rests on one core idea. This is what humans evolved eating for millions of years before agriculture ruined everything. It's a compelling story. It's also not what the archaeological evidence actually shows. To be fair, part of the premise is accurate. Humans did evolve as hunters and gatherers for the vast majority of our history, long before farming existed. Meat absolutely was part of that diet, in many times and places. Nobody disputes that. But the paleo diet doesn't just claim ancient humans ate meat, it claims a very specific meat-heavy, low-carb template and insists that's what our bodies were built for everywhere, across the entire Paleolithic era. That's the part the evidence pushes back on hard. So where did this specific meat-heavy version of ancient eating even come from? Walter Voigtland, a gastroenterologist who published a book in 1975, arguing humans were biologically built to be carnivores. His work was picked up and popularized decades later by Lauren Cordain, an exercise physiologist whose best-selling books in the 2000s turned the idea into a global movement. Cordain's version leaned heavily on a specific image: the big game hunter chasing mammoths and bison across the Ice Age tundra. It's a vivid, compelling picture. It's also based on a very narrow slice of humanity, mostly cold climate, high-latitude populations, where preserved animal bones survive well in the archaeological record. Plant remains, by contrast, rot. They don't fossilize nearly as easily as bone. For decades, that created a genuine bias in the evidence itself. Archaeologists were finding far more animal bones than plant remains, not necessarily because ancient people ate mostly meat, but because meat was simply what survived to be found. It took newer techniques, starch residue testing, to finally reveal the plant-based side of the diet that bone evidence alone had been hiding. Start with the Neanderthals, since they're the poster image of the primitive, meat-obsessed caveman. In 2011, researchers published a study that upended that image completely. They examined dental calculus, preserved on Neanderthal teeth from sites in Iraq and Belgium. Trapped inside that ancient plaque, microscopic starch grains, grains from date palms, from legumes, from wild grass seeds. And many of those starch grains showed a very specific kind of damage, the exact kind that only happens when starch is cooked. Neanderthals weren't just eating meat around a fire. They were gathering, processing, and cooking plant foods as a regular part of their diet. This wasn't a one-off. Similar starch evidence has since turned up at multiple other Paleolithic sites across Europe and the Levant. If that seems too recent or too regional, go back further and further south. In a limestone cave in Mozambique, archaeologist Julio Mercader excavated a set of ancient stone tools: grinders, scrapers, the kind of tools used to process plant food. Coated across their surfaces, thousands of preserved starch granules. The source: wild sorghum, a grass seed. The age of these tools: roughly 105,000 years old. That's not a typo. Humans were systematically harvesting and grinding wild grains into food over 100,000 years before agriculture existed, and tens of thousands of years before the earliest evidence researchers had previously found for this kind of behavior. Grains weren't a late addition to the human diet. They were already part of it, deep in the Stone Age, on a different continent than where Neanderthals were doing the exact same thing. So historical humans ate plants. Fine. But what about people living as hunter-gatherers today, closer to how our ancestors actually lived? If the paleo model were right, you'd expect their diets to be heavily meat-dominant too. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe spent years studying the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania, one of the last groups on Earth still living primarily off foraging and hunting. His research and subsequent studies found that plant foods, tubers, berries, baobab fruit, honey make up somewhere between 50 and 65% of the Hadza diet by calories. Not a minor side dish. More than half their entire caloric intake. Other hunter-gatherer groups studied show similar or even higher numbers. The San people of the Kalahari get an estimated 60 to 80% of their diet from wild plants. These aren't outlier communities eating unusually. They're some of the best living reference points we have for how humans have sustained themselves outside of agriculture. And none of them match the meat-heavy template being sold as how ancient humans ate. You might be thinking, sure, some groups eat more plants because of where they happen to live. Doesn't that just prove environment matters, not that the whole paleo idea is wrong? That pushback actually proves the point rather than defeating it. Environment is exactly the issue. Paleolithic isn't one place, or one time. It's a period spanning roughly 2.5 million years across every inhabited continent on Earth. Through ice ages, warm periods, deserts, forests, coastlines, and tundra, a group living in the Arctic Circle, surviving mostly on fat and meat from marine mammals, and a group foraging in tropical Africa, living mostly on tubers, fruit, and wild grain, were both, technically, eating a Paleolithic diet. They were eating almost opposite diets. There was never a single template. There were thousands of different diets, shaped entirely by geography, climate, and whatever happened to be available to eat. So here's the actual, stated plainly truth. Ancient humans absolutely ate meat, sometimes in large quantities. But across the planet, plant foods were not the enemy being avoided. They were the majority of what people actually ate. The modern paleo diet isn't really describing ancient human eating patterns, it's describing one narrow, modern guess about them, built mostly around imagining what a mammoth hunter's dinner probably looked like, and ignoring the millions of years and the millions of square miles where that image simply doesn't hold up. None of this means meat is bad, or that a lower-carb diet can't work for someone today. That's a separate, personal question. And the science on modern nutrition is its own conversation entirely. But if you're doing it because you believe you're eating the way humans evolved to eat, the evidence tells a messier, more interesting story. Humans evolved to eat whatever worked, wherever they happened to be standing. And for a very large share of our species' history, in a very large share of the places we lived, that meant digging up a root, grinding a wild grain, and cooking it over the same fire as the meat.